Despite his later portrayal as a monstrous, evil hunchback by Shakespeare and the Tudors, the reality of Richard III's life and death were much more nuanced. From his upbringing in the midst of the Wars of the Roses to his ultimate death at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard faced many challenges throughout his relatively short life, ultimately being just 32 at the time of his death. But was Richard really the monstrous figure that the Tudors would happily have you believe, or is the truth much more complicated? Those are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video, so with that intro out the way, let's get straight into it. Richard was born on the 2nd of October 1452 at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire to the powerful Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and his wife Cecily Neville, becoming the youngest of their children to survive infancy. Richard's childhood coincided with the beginning of what is now known as the Wars of the Roses, primarily fought between his family known as the Yorkists, who supported his father's potential claim to the throne, and the opposing Lancastrians, who remained loyal to the mentally unstable and weak Henry VI. 4 years after this conflict began, in 1459, his father and the Yorkists were forced to flee England, resulting in Richard and one of his older brothers, George, being placed in the custody of their aunt, Anne Neville, Duchess of Buckingham. These two younger sons of the Duke would not remain under their roof for long, however, as following their father and elder brother Edmund's return to England and eventual deaths at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December 1460, the pair were sent by their mother to the Low Countries out of fear for their lives. Despite the catastrophic blow that had been dealt to the Yorkists, they fought on under the leadership of Richard's now oldest surviving brother Edward, who, at the age of just 18 years old, managed to lead their armies to victory at the decisive Battle of Towton. Following Towton, with the Lancastrian armies essentially being crushed, Edward and their mother thought it was safe enough for the young brothers to return to England, shortly after participating in the coronation of Edward, who became Edward IV on the 28th of June 1461. During this process, Richard was also named Duke of Gloucester and made both a Knight of the Garter and a Knight of the Bath, despite being just 8 years old at the time. Following this rise in station, Richard spent several of the next years of his childhood at Middleham Castle in Wensleydale, Yorkshire, under the tutelage of his cousin Richard Neville, 16th Earl of Warwick, later known as the Kingmaker because of his role in the Wars of the Roses. During this time, Warwick supervised Richard's training as a knight, which is evidenced by the fact that in the autumn of 1465, Edward granted Warwick £1,000 for the expenses of this training. While at Warwick's estate, it is likely that Richard met Francis Lovell, who became a firm supporter of his later in his life, as well as Warwick's younger daughter and his future wife, Anne Neville. It is possible that even at this early stage, Warwick was considering both Richard and George as strategic and political matches for his daughters, Isabel and Anne, as was common practice at the time. It is also believed to have been during this time in his adolescence that, due to an unknown, though likely genetic/hereditary cause, Richard developed scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine. This condition is likely what contributed to his later portrayal as a monstrous hunchback, though following the discovery of his remains in 2014, it is now believed that his scoliosis was quite mild and probably didn't cause any major physical deformity that could not be disguised by clothing, nor any hindrances to his movement or physical ability, with the only noticeable observation for the keen-eyed being that his right shoulder sat 1 or 2 inches above his left. Either way, in the years that followed, despite their once close ties, the relationship between the king and Warwick began to deteriorate due to disagreements regarding foreign policy and the latter's decision to secretly marry Elizabeth Woodville, seemingly out of love or other factors, as she was from a low-ranking noble family and someone considered beneath the king by many, also not helped by the fact that she had already been married, with her first husband having been a minor supporter of the Lancastrians, killed at the Second Battle of St. Albans in 1461. These tensions ultimately resulted in Warwick launching a revolt against the king with the support of his other younger brother George in 1469, who went on to marry one of Warwick's daughters in the July of that year in Calais without the king's permission, before the two rebels sailed back to England to raise an army. During this revolt, the now almost 17-year-old Richard remained loyal to Edward, even though he was rumoured to have been having an affair with his future wife, the other daughter of Warwick, Anne. The rebellion initially didn't go well for the two brothers, who were forced to flee to Burgundy in October 1470 to their sister and her husband, after Warwick joined forces with the Lancastrians, alienating George in the process. During their stay in France, Edward managed to convince Charles the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, to help him regain the throne, resulting in Edward and Richard crossing the Channel, leading an army raised with Burgundian money. Following their arrival, the now completely disillusioned George accepted Edward's offer of a pardon and rejoined his brothers at Coventry on the 2nd of April 1471. It would be roughly 2 weeks following this reunion that the armies of Warwick and the Yorkists would finally meet when, on the 14th of April 1471, under the cover of darkness, the Yorkists moved close to the Lancastrians' lines and clashed in a thick fog at dawn. The actions of the now 18-year-old Richard during this battle would prove to be quite influential, despite his more slender and, in the minds of some, delicate build compared to his 6'4" eldest brother. During the intense and soon to prove very bloody battle, Richard led the Yorkists' right flank and successfully managed to outflank and beat back his Lancastrian opponent, Henry Holland, 3rd Duke of Exeter, and though his advance was slow due to his group fighting up a slight slope, the pressure he exerted on the Lancastrian left wing rotated the entire battle line. In the end, the battle resulted in a decisive Yorkist victory, with both Warwick and his brother being killed, dealing a significant blow against the Lancastrian cause. Richard's influence would be felt once again at the subsequent Battle of Tewkesbury, where he led the vanguard, being the first line of the army to meet the enemy, and traditionally considered the most dangerous, but also one of the most prestigious sections. This battle, like the Battle of Barnet just a few weeks prior, resulted in a decisive Yorkist victory, with many prominent Lancastrians being killed in the battle, including the Lancastrian king Henry VI's 17-year-old son, Prince Edward. The Earl of Devon and Baron Wenlock were also among the slain, with the Duke of Somerset himself, John Beaufort, one of Henry VI's most crucial supporters and military leaders, being executed after the battle on the orders of Richard. Following these decisive blows against the Lancastrian cause, in the following year Richard married Anne Neville, if you remember her from earlier, who had actually been married to the aforementioned Prince Edward, who had been killed in the battle. Not everyone was the biggest fan of this marriage, however, namely Richard's older brother George, who only grudgingly accepted it due to reasons of inheritance, seeing as he had previously married Anne's sister. This unsurprisingly resulted in, even after their marriage, the relationship between the two brothers remaining strained, prompting the king himself to attempt to put the brothers in their place by acting as a stifler between them. To this end, in early 1474, the Parliament assembled as Edward attempted to reconcile the two by stating that both men and their wives would enjoy the Warwick inheritance just as if the Countess of Warwick was naturally dead. This seems to have done little to mend their relationship, however, and after this point, it seems the king began to openly favour Richard, who was rewarded with all the Neville lands in the north of England in 1475, becoming the dominant magnate in the region where he was highly regarded, especially in the city of York. A significant development in the family dynamic would occur 2 years later, in 1477, when George, who had become a bit mentally unstable by this time, convinced his wife had been poisoned by one of her ladies-in-waiting, though this was unlikely, judicially killed one of them by hanging after bullying a jury into finding her guilty of murder by poisoning, after which he, likely at least partially influenced by his now volatile mental state, launched yet another short-lived rebellion against Edward, subsequently being imprisoned and executed by his brother on the 18th of February 1478, aged just 28 years old, with a rumour soon spreading that he had been drowned in a cask of wine. Despite the animosity between the two, it appears Richard had no involvement in this, as he was preoccupied in the north due to growing threats of war with Scotland. This war seemed all but imminent by 1480, with Richard taking actions throughout the year to repel and counter the ever-increasing border raids which were common between the two nations, before the King and Council formally declared war on Scotland in November. Following this declaration, the king himself was expected to ride north to lead the army, however he failed to do so, resulting in only intermittent skirmishing until early 1482, at which point Richard took matters into his own hands, personally leading a 20,000-man army into Scotland, taking the town of Berwick, which has remained English since, on the 24th of August, and briefly occupying Edinburgh before returning home. Richard would soon be needed in the south, however, after Edward, whose health had been in decline for some time by this point, despite only being around 40 years old, fell fatally ill at Easter 1483, before dying on the 9th of April, but not before naming Richard as Lord Protector of the realm in order to assist his 12-year-old son, the now Edward V. Following this, Richard soon made his way south, quickly imprisoning and executing Anthony Woodville, 2nd Earl of Rivers, the brother of the now widowed Queen Elizabeth, as well as his nephew Richard Grey, and another one of their associates, on the charges they had engaged in treason against the Lord Protector and plotted to deny him his role, with Richard Grey actually being a half-brother of the new king. Shortly after this, the young Edward V entered the capital for the first time following his father's death with his uncle in tow, where he resided in the royal apartments of the Tower of London, where kings customarily awaited their coronation. A few weeks later, in early June, Richard wrote to many influential nobles asking for their support against the Queen, her blood adherents and affinity, whom he suspected of plotting his murder after she fled to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey following her brother's arrest on the 30th of April and later execution. At a council meeting on the 13th of June at the Tower of London, Richard then accused William Hastings, a man who had actually assisted him with his installation as Lord Protector and a rival of the Woodvilles, of high treason and conspiring against his life with the Woodvilles, subsequently having him executed and a few others imprisoned. This execution was controversial at the time and has since been interpreted differently by modern historians. Some believe Richard simply wanted to get Hastings out the way, as he was extremely loyal to Edward IV and his heirs, while others are more open to the possibility that such a plot did actually exist. It would be about a week and a half later that Robert Stillington, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, is said to have informed Richard that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had indeed been invalid due to Edward's earlier union with Eleanor Butler, therefore making Edward V and his siblings illegitimate and Richard the next in line to the throne. Following this revelation, on the 22nd of June, a sermon was preached outside Old St. Paul's Cathedral by Ralph Shah, declaring Edward IV's children bastards and Richard the rightful king, shortly after which the citizens of London, nobles and commons convened and drew up a petition asking Richard to assume the throne, which he promptly accepted on the 26th of June before being crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of July 1483. Now comes the most controversial event of Richard's life, as not long after his coronation, the princes, his nephews, who were still lodged in the royal residence of the Tower of London at the time, disappeared from sight, with them presumably having been killed. Though Richard remains the primary suspect in their disappearance and likely deaths for obvious reasons, many other suspects have been put forward, as many men in London at the time would have benefited from their demise, including the powerful and soon-to-be rebellious Henry Stafford, Duke of Bellingham, and even the Lancastrian future King Henry VII, who was in exile at the time. It has even been hypothesized that the princes managed to escape London, as some figures later on claimed to be either one of them and garnered some support. Be that as it may, following his coronation, Richard and his wife Anne set out on a royal progress throughout the country to meet their subjects. During this trip, they endowed King's College and Queen's College at Cambridge University and made grants to the church. Also during this time, still feeling a strong bond with his northern lands, Richard later planned the establishment of a large chantry chapel in York Minster with over 100 priests before further founding the College of Arms. Either shortly following or during this journey in 1483, a conspiracy began to arise against Richard among a number of displeased noblemen, many of whom had actually been supporters of Edward IV and the whole Yorkist establishment. This conspiracy was nominally led by Richard's former ally and potential suspect in the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, the Duke of Buckingham, though it is believed it had begun as a Woodville-Beaufort conspiracy, already being well underway by the time Buckingham became involved. It has actually been suggested by some modern historians that it was only the subsequent parliamentary attainder that placed Buckingham at the centre of events, to blame a disaffected magnate motivated by greed rather than the embarrassing truth that those opposing Richard were actually overwhelmingly Edwardian loyalists. Either way, it is possible that these rebels had planned to depose Richard and place Edward V back on the throne, but when rumours arose that Edward and his brother were dead, Buckingham proposed that Henry Tudor, the later Henry VII, should return from exile, take the throne, and marry Elizabeth, eldest daughter of Edward IV, and niece to Richard, thus uniting the two warring factions. Regardless of the exact details of the plan at that time, Buckingham raised a substantial force from his estates in Wales and the Marches, while Henry, at this time in exile in Brittany, with the support of the Breton treasurer Pierre Landais, who hoped Buckingham's victory would cement an alliance between Brittany and England, made his way back home, anchoring off Plymouth while he awaited news of Buckingham's efforts. Unfortunately for Henry, Buckingham's army had become disturbed by a storm that was passing through the region at the time, and deserted when Richard's forces came against them. Buckingham attempted to escape in disguise, but is believed to have either been turned in by a retainer for the bounty Richard had put on his head, or was otherwise discovered in hiding with him. Buckingham was unsurprisingly then convicted of treason and beheaded in Salisbury near the Bullheads Inn on the 2nd of November. Following the quelling of this rebellion, Henry fled back to France while Richard made offers to Landais, offering military support for his weak regime under Francis II, Duke of Brittany, in exchange for Henry. Landais would not have the chance to betray Henry, however, as he soon fled to Paris, where he actually managed to secure support from the French regent Anne of Beaujeu, who even went as far as to supply troops to Henry for his planned invasion. This invasion finally came on the 7th of August 1485, when Henry's forces landed in his native Wales, at Mill Bay in the southwestern tip of the country, where they easily captured the nearby Dale Castle. Despite his hopes, Henry received limited support from the local population, and at first few individual Welshmen joined his army as it continued its march inland. Historian Geoffrey Elton suggests that at this time only Henry's ardent supporters felt pride over his Welsh blood, his family having hailed from the island of Anglesey in the country's north. In saying that though, his arrival had been hailed by some contemporary bards as the true prince and the youth of Brittany defeating the Saxons, in order to bring their country back to glory. Either way, as Henry moved further inland and eventually made his way to Haverfordwest, the county town of Pembrokeshire, Richard's lieutenant in South Wales, who like all of Richard's supporters had been expecting this invasion, failed to move against Henry, while two of his officers, Richard Griffith and Evan Morgan, deserted to Henry with their men. While those two were impactful, probably the most important defector to Henry in this early stage was Rhys ap Thomas, who was the leading figure in West Wales, after having been offered the lieutenancy of the entirety of Wales in exchange for his fealty. These two men and their armies, Rhys having recruited between 500 to 2,000 Welshmen en route, united at Cefn-de-Gaulle, Welshpool, before crossing the English border together and making for the town of Shrewsbury by the 15th or 16th of August. After having rested at Shrewsbury, and although London was his goal, Henry did not move directly towards the city, instead sending his forces eastward and slowly moving about Staffordshire, hoping to delay the confrontation with Richard so that he could continue to gather more recruits to his cause. Richard, on the other hand, rode out from Nottingham to Leicester on the 20th of August, joining his close companion and ardent supporter John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, with the Duke of Northumberland arriving the following day, after which the royal army began their march westward to intercept Henry's march on London. Passing Sutton Cheney, Richard then moved his army towards Ambion Hill, which he thought would be of tactical value, and made camp on it. It was said that this night Richard's sleep was not peaceful, presumably due to the oncoming battle, and his face was more livid and ghastly than usual. The two armies would fatefully meet on the 22nd of August 1485, with Richard's forces greatly outnumbering those of Henry, despite all of the latter's efforts, with the Yorkist army variously estimated at between 7,500 and 12,000 men, while Henry's is believed to have numbered only 5,000 to 8,000. While the exact details of the battle that came are unclear, it is generally believed that Henry started by moving his army towards Ambion Hill, where Richard and his men stood. As Henry's army advanced past the marsh at the southwestern foot of the hill, Richard sent a message to Baron Stanley, threatening to execute his son Lord Strange if Stanley did not join the attack on Henry immediately. Stanley, however, somewhat callously replied that he had other sons, causing the now furious Richard to order the beheading of Stanley's son, though his officers hesitated, saying that battle was imminent and it would be more convenient to carry out the execution afterwards. During this time, Henry had also sent messages to Stanley, asking him to declare his allegiance, though his reply was evasive, and that the Stanleys would naturally come after Henry had given orders to his army and arranged them for battle, forcing Henry to confront Richard's forces alone. As the Lancastrians manoeuvred around the marsh, seeking firmer ground to fight on, they were harassed by Richard's cannons. Once Oxford, who had been placed in command of Henry's forces, due to Henry's inexperience as a military commander and his men were clear of the marsh, Norfolk, who was leading Richard's vanguard, and several other contingents of their army under the command of Sir Robert Brackenbury started to advance. Oxford's men proved the hardier of the two sides in the ensuing combat, holding their ground against the Yorkists, with several of Norfolk's men fleeing the field. Norfolk is believed to have also lost one of his senior officers, Walter Devereux, in this early clash. Recognizing that his force was at a disadvantage, Richard then signalled for Northumberland to assist, however the Northerners group showed no signs of movement, with many historians believing Northumberland chose not to aid his king for personal reasons, though it is worth noting some others believe it would have been nigh on impossible for Northumberland to join the battlefield given his position and the difficult ground in between. Either way, it was at this point that Richard, seeing Henry at some distance behind his main force, decided to end the fight quickly by killing the enemy commander. It is possible that this decision was partially influenced by the death of Richard's close companion, John Howard, Duke of Norfolk, which may have had a demoralising effect on both the king and his men, with the clearly diminishing situation on the field also likely playing a factor. Prior to this charge, Richard was said to have exclaimed, "I will die King of England. I will not budge a foot. Treason, treason, treason," thereafter leading his cavalry deep into the enemy ranks. All accounts, even those unfavourable to Richard and responsible for his later slandering, note that King Richard fought bravely and ably during this manoeuvre, unhorsing Sir John Shane, a well-known jousting champion, killing Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, and even coming within a sword's length of Henry Tudor himself, before Sir William Stanley, son of the aforementioned Baron Stanley, came to Henry's aid, surrounding Richard and killing him, making Richard the last English king to be killed in battle alongside the likes of Richard the Lionheart and the earlier Harold Godwinson. The soon-to-be Henry VII's official historian wrote of the matter that King Richard alone was killed fighting manfully in the thickest press of his enemies, while the Burgundian chronicler Jean Molyneux provides more detail, asserting that it was a Welshman who struck the death blow with a halberd while Richard's horse was stuck in the marshy ground. It was said that the blows were so violent that the king's helmet was driven into his skull. Supporting Molyneux's recordings was the identification of 11 wounds, 8 of them to the skull, clearly inflicted in battle, and suggesting he had lost his helmet following the discovery of Richard's body. Professor Guy Rutty from the University of Leicester said of the wounds that the most likely injuries to have caused the king's death are the 2 to the inferior aspect of the skull, a large sharp force trauma, possibly from a sword or staff weapon such as a halberd or bill, and a penetrating injury from the tip of an edged weapon. His wounds were so severe that his skull even showed that a part of the back of it had been hacked away. Following the battle, Richard's naked body was then carried back to Leicester tied to a horse, and early sources strongly suggest that it was displayed in the Collegiate Church of the Annunciation of Our Lady of the New Waycra, prior to being hastily and discreetly buried in the choir of Greyfriars Church in Leicester, where it was ultimately discovered over 500 years later. Well guys, I think that's where I'm going to end the video. If you had any other kings of England, or any country even, you would like to see me make a video on, feel free to let me know in the comments. As always though, if you're still here, you're a legend, and if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like, and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. With that being said though, I hope you all have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you in the next one.